Hey everyone, don't forget to leave a comment letting us know what you thought about the stories and the narration. We really want to hear your feedback to keep improving and bringing you more chilling content. Now, get ready. Let's dive into the stories. The silence was absolute. I could hear the soft sound of the wind blowing through the trees, but other than that, there was nothing. And that was exactly what I wanted. The country house, with its large windows and the smell of old wood, seemed like the perfect refuge to escape the chaos of the city. I needed this isolation, this silence, to reconnect with myself. The house was far from any movement. The dirt road leading here was almost invisible, hidden by tall trees and dense vegetation. When I first arrived, I felt somewhat disconnected from the world, but that was the idea. A place far away from everything and everyone. I spent the day exploring the area, walking along trails and listening to the sound of a nearby creek. The fresh air revitalized me, and the peace seemed to fill every part of me. At night, after a hot bath, I made a cup of tea and sat on the living room sofa, gazing out the window as the dusk settled. But as the sun set, the silence began to feel different. Something about the darkness brought a slight uneasiness. I decided to ignore the discomfort, convincing myself that it was just the exhaustion from the trip. That night, while trying to relax, something bothered me. My phone. I picked it up from beside the sofa, expecting to see a notification or message, but I noticed there was no signal. The internet had also stopped working. At first, I thought it was a normal outage for such a remote area, and I continued trying not to worry. But then, I saw something through the window. A light. Faint, distant, but definitely a flashlight. It was moving among the trees, back and forth, as if someone was circling the property. My heart began to race. I approached the window, trying to get a better look, but the flashlight remained, swaying in the darkness. Who would be out there, in the middle of the night, in such an isolated place? I backed away from the window and closed all the curtains. My stomach churned, and my entire body tensed. Something was wrong. I ran to the front door and locked it tightly, checking the windows. The discomfort I had felt earlier had now turned into fear. I was alone, with no phone signal, no internet, and someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, the lights went out. The electricity had been cut. The house plunged into complete darkness, and for a moment, I was completely frozen. It was as if the world around me had stopped, leaving only the distant sound of the wind outside. I tried to stay calm. I grabbed the flashlight I had stored in the kitchen and turned it on, casting a weak glow in front of me. The flickering light didn't help much, but at least I could see the basics. My entire body was trembling. I walked toward the back door and checked it. It was locked. But then I heard something. Soft sounds, footsteps, as if someone was walking around the house, trying to find a way in. I moved toward one of the windows and peered through the curtain's cracks. The flashlight that had once been distant was now much closer. The intruder was approaching. That's when I heard the sound that made my heart skip a beat. The front door handle being jiggled. He was trying to get in. I knew I didn't have much time. Fear coursed through my veins as I thought about an escape. Staying in that house was too dangerous. I had to flee, and fast. I headed to the back door, unlocking it as quietly as possible while clutching the flashlight tightly in my hand. I opened a small crack of the door and felt the cold night wind hit my face. I waited for a moment, trying to listen for any nearby sounds. Everything seemed quiet, but I knew he was out there. With the door open enough to slip out, I made my move. I stepped outside, and that's when I saw it. The light from the flashlight. It was only a few meters away. He was there, on the other side of the house, but close enough to see me. My body went into full alert, and before he could react, I ran. I ran as fast as my legs would take me, every breath turning into a silent scream of terror. The flashlight swung wildly in my hand, casting shadows on the trees as I plunged into the forest. The sound of his footsteps behind me was clear. He was chasing me. The road was ahead of me, a thin line of asphalt that seemed like my only chance of survival. My legs were exhausted. My body screamed for rest, but I knew I couldn't stop. I kept running, with the sound of footsteps growing louder behind me with each passing second. Then I saw it. Headlights. A car. I waved my arms frantically, trying to get the driver's attention, and the car began to slow down. A wave of relief washed over me, if only for a moment. I was safe. The car stopped, and I practically threw myself against the driver's window, begging for help. "Please, someone is chasing me," I managed to say, my voice faltering. The driver, an older man, looked at me with concern and opened the door. "Get in quickly," he said, and I got into the car without a second thought. The sound of the engine starting was an instant relief, and the car began to move slowly down the road. I looked out the back window, still expecting to see the figure of the intruder emerging from the forest shadows, but all I saw was darkness. The driver asked me what had happened, and I, breathless, tried to explain. He looked at me through the rearview mirror a few times, concerned, but something about his gaze began to unsettle me. It was a look that lasted too long. The way he watched me made me uncomfortable. "Do you live far from here?" he asked, but something in his tone made me shiver. It seemed like a simple question, but there was something more, something I couldn't quite figure out. Suddenly, the relief I had felt started to unravel. The man was driving too slowly, and the smile that appeared on his lips was like a bad omen. He already knew where he was taking me. He didn't need to ask. Living alone in the countryside was everything I had ever wanted. The peace and quiet were welcome companions after years of living in the chaos of the city. My house was in an isolated area, surrounded by trees and vast open land. The nights were long and tranquil. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of the houses would have become part of my nighttime routine. That night, I was relaxing with a cup of tea and a book in my hands when a sudden knock on the door made me jump out of the chair. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first reaction was to hesitate, but I went to the door anyway, curious to know who could be there at that hour. "Ben?" I said, opening the door and finding my neighbor standing there, a serious look on his face. "Sorry to bother you, Tom," he said, glancing around as if checking the surroundings. "I saw someone walking near your house just a little while ago. I don't know who it was, but I thought you should know." That caught me off guard. I thanked him for the warning, trying to stay calm, but as soon as Ben left, my mind started racing. I shut the door and immediately checked all the windows and doors. Everything seemed fine. Still, a sense of unease began to take hold of me. Did he really see someone? I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. After all, I hadn't seen anything myself, but Ben's warning lingered in my mind like a shadow. I went back to the chair, but reading no longer gave me the same comfort. Every sound seemed louder, more menacing. The creaks of the houses would grow sharper, and the wind outside now carried something ominous with it. I got up again, walked to the window, and looked out. All I could see was darkness. No movement, no sign of life. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my mind. I was safe, or at least I should have been. Even so, the discomfort wouldn't leave. I thought about calling Ben, asking if he had seen anything else, but I decided against it. I didn't want to come off as paranoid. He had already done me the favor of warning me. There was no reason to bother him more. Yet, with each passing minute, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. I tried to ignore it, but as the night went on, the idea that someone was lurking around my house kept me alert. I heard noises, or maybe I was imagining things. I didn't know, but deep down, I knew that the tranquility of the night had been shattered, and I couldn't return to my normal state. I'm not sure what woke me up. The clock on the wall read just past 2 in the morning when a muffled sound pulled me from sleep. I stayed still in bed, trying to identify what I had heard. Then I heard it again, footsteps. There was definitely someone walking around the house. My heart raced. I got up slowly, careful not to make any noise, and headed to the kitchen window, where the sound seemed to be coming from. I peeked through the curtain, but all I saw was darkness. Everything outside seemed normal, until the sound of metal scraping made me freeze. Someone was trying to force the window open. I tried not to panic, but it was hard to stay calm. I took a deep breath and quietly returned to the living room, grabbing my phone. I needed help, but at the same time, the fear of the person outside hearing any movement paralyzed me. With my phone in hand, I dialed the police. My voice trembled as I explained the situation, trying to be as clear and quick as possible. I told them someone was trying to break into my house. You mentioned that your neighbor warned you about this person? The dispatcher asked. Yes, he came by earlier, I replied, still in shock at what was happening. The dispatcher paused for too long, and I knew something was wrong. Sir, your neighbor. We've received reports that he's been involved in break-ins around the area. We believe he might be using these warnings to divert suspicion while participating in the burglaries. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Ben? The same Ben who had warned me about the danger? I couldn't believe it. At the same time, everything began to make sense. The warning, the apparent concern, it was all part of a plan. Fear now mixed with anger and betrayal. I had to act, and fast. I couldn't trust anyone. Knowing they were close to breaking in, I began to formulate a defense plan. Whatever happened, I wasn't going to make it easy for them. I was surrounded. As I walked around the house, looking for something to defend myself with, more noises outside confirmed that at least 2 people were there. Adrenaline took over me. I knew I couldn't wait. I grabbed a gun I kept in the bedroom closet. I didn't want to use it, but I couldn't afford to be caught off guard either. The noises grew louder, and soon I realized they were trying the front door. I turned off all the lights and hid in the living room behind the couch, waiting for their next move. My breathing was fast, my entire body trembling, but my mind was focused on one thing: survival. Then, finally, I heard the door being forced. The sound of wood breaking echoed through the house. They were inside. When the door opened, I saw 2 figures cautiously stepping inside. Even in the dark, I recognized Ben's silhouette at the front, with an accomplice behind him. They were being careful, trying not to make any noise. I held the gun tightly, waiting for the right moment to act. When Ben entered the living room, I rose from my hiding spot, pointing the gun directly at him. The surprise was clear on his face, but his expression quickly turned to something darker. You thought I wouldn't figure it out? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. The police are already on their way. Ben took a step forward, but I didn't lower the gun. The tension in the air was palpable. I knew any hesitation on my part could be fatal. Then, the sirens cut through the night silence. Ben glanced at his accomplice, visibly shaken. Their time was running out. The sirens got closer, and Ben finally realized he had no way out. He raised his hands, as did the accomplice. I kept the gun trained on them until the police entered the house and handcuffed them. When it was all over, and they were taken away, an overwhelming exhaustion hit me. I sat in the chair, staring into space. Ben's betrayal weighed heavily on my shoulders. I had never imagined that someone I knew could do something like this. That sense of security I had so cherished had been destroyed. Now, looking out into the darkness beyond the windows, I knew that my life in the countryside would never be the same. The isolation that had once brought me peace now only reminded me of how vulnerable I was. I closed my eyes for a moment, but I found no relief in the silence. Danger had always been closer than I ever imagined. The rain was pouring that night. Julie and I were at home, trying to unwind after a long day, but the constant drumming of the raindrops against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder kept me on edge. Julie sat next to me on the couch, and even though we had a movie playing, the storm outside seemed to be creeping into our mood. It's really coming down out there, Julie said, glancing at the fogged-up window. Before I could reply, something unexpected happened. A knock on the door. Not a gentle one, but firm and insistent. enough to make us exchange confused looks. Who would be out in a storm like this? The knock came again, louder this time. "I'll see who it is," I muttered, getting up from the couch, even though that strange feeling in my gut was growing heavier. I knew Julie was as uneasy as I was, but we couldn't just ignore it. I walked toward the door, paused for a moment, then opened it. Standing there was a young woman, completely drenched. Her hair was stuck to her face, and her eyes looked panicked. "Please, my car broke down. I don't know where to go. Can I use your phone?" Her voice was shaky, almost pleading. I glanced back at Julie, who was standing at the edge of the room. I could see the discomfort on her face, and I felt it too. Something didn't feel right, but the girl was soaked, and it didn't seem right to turn her away. Julie gave a slight nod, and I stepped aside, letting her in. As soon as she stepped inside, the warmth of the house clashed with her soaked clothes. Julie hurried to grab a towel while I shut the door behind her, a heavy feeling weighing down on me. Something about this whole situation just felt off. "Here, you can dry off," Julie said, handing her the towel. "Thank you. I just need to use the phone. My cell died, and I'm not sure what else to do," she said, attempting a weak smile. I pointed to the phone in the kitchen, and she walked over. Julie moved closer to me and whispered, "Something's wrong, Sam. I don't know what it is, but I'm uncomfortable." I nodded in agreement, feeling the same, but pushed the paranoia aside. Maybe it was just the storm and the unexpected situation. Soon enough, the young woman came back from the kitchen, looking somewhat relieved. I called for a tow, but they said it'll take a while because of the storm. "If it's not too much trouble, could I wait here?" I exchanged another look with Julie. She hesitated for a moment, but then forced a polite smile. "Of course, you can wait." The silence that followed was thick, the only sound being the rain pounding against the windows. The tension in the room was palpable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the constant sound of rain outside. Julie and I exchanged nervous glances, trying to act like everything was normal, but the atmosphere was tense. The young woman sat on the edge of the couch, glancing occasionally at the windows, her face expressionless. Suddenly, there was another knock. This time, it wasn't just a knock. It was a hard, insistent pounding. Julie froze, her face going pale as she looked at me. "Who could that be now?" she whispered, her voice trembling. My heart raced. I stood up slowly and approached the door, dread creeping into my chest. I peered through the small window next to the door, but all I could see was darkness and rain. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound firm. No answer, just the sound of the rain. "Maybe we shouldn't open it," Julie whispered from behind me. Before I could decide what to do, there was another bang. This time harder, like someone was trying to force their way in. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, but instinct took over. I threw the door open. What happened next was a blur. A man, tall and menacing, shoved me aside and barged into the house. I stumbled back, too shocked to react. The young woman stood up from the couch, calm and collected, as if she had been expecting this. "Close the door," the man said coldly, not even looking at me. He was inside now, and everything had changed. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew, in that moment, that we had just fallen into a trap. The man, now standing in the middle of the room, glanced at Julie, who was frozen in fear. "We've been watching you for a while," he said casually, as if making small talk. "We knew you'd be alone tonight. The storm just made it easier." The young woman, who had seemed so vulnerable just moments ago, now stood confidently by his side. The change in her demeanor was chilling. "Thanks for the hospitality," she said with a smirk. "Now, let's make this easy. Just cooperate, and no one gets hurt." I was paralyzed. All the alarm bells that had been going off in my head earlier were now blaring, but it was too late. They had us cornered. The man pulled a gun from his coat and pointed it directly at me. "Sit down. Don't make this harder than it has to be," he ordered, his voice cold and controlled. Julie was shaking, tears welling up in her eyes. I felt the same terror, but I couldn't let it show. I had to stay calm. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man smiled grimly. "What do you think? Money, jewelry, anything of value. Just sit tight while we take what we want, and this will all be over soon." The young woman began walking around the house, rummaging through drawers and cabinets. I felt powerless, my mind racing for a way out, but I knew one wrong move could end it all in an instant. I watched the man closely, every nerve in my body on edge. Julie was beside me, trembling, and I knew I had to protect her. But how? This guy was armed, and his accomplice was tearing through our belongings. I tried reasoning with him. "Look, we don't want any trouble. Take whatever you want. Just leave us alone." His eyes narrowed. "I told you to shut up. Don't push it." Just then, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. The young woman had knocked over something, and the man turned his head, distracted for just a second. I didn't think. I acted. I lunged at him, grabbing his arm and forcing the gun upward. A shot rang out, but the bullet only hit the ceiling, sending splinters of wood flying. Julie screamed as I wrestled with the man, trying to get the gun away from him. But he was strong, stronger than I anticipated. The young woman rushed back into the room, grabbing a heavy lamp and swinging it at me. I barely dodged, but the force of the attack made me lose my grip on the man. He tackled me to the ground, and we struggled as Julie cried out in fear. "Sam!" she screamed, her voice cracking. While I fought with everything I had, Julie made a move I hadn't expected. She slipped quietly toward the phone. With trembling fingers, she dialed emergency services and whispered our address into the receiver. I could hear the fear in her voice, but she was keeping it together. The man landed a punch to my side, knocking the wind out of me. I tried to push him off, but he was overpowering me. I glanced over at Julie, who had just finished the call. "They're coming," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear but filled with determination. The man must have heard the sirens in the distance, too, because he looked up, realizing time was running out. His accomplice, the young woman, was already at the door, ready to flee. "We need to go," she urged him, panic creeping into her voice. The man gave me one last hateful glare, then stood up. Together, they rushed out into the night, disappearing into the storm as the sound of approaching police cars grew louder. The house was in shambles, but Julie and I were still standing. Barely. The sound of sirens filled the air as the police finally arrived, their lights flashing outside, casting eerie red and blue shadows across the walls. I pulled Julie close to me, both of us shaking from the adrenaline and fear. "It's over," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. The physical danger was gone, but the emotional toll of what had just happened was overwhelming. The police burst in, guns drawn, but when they saw us, they quickly understood the situation. I explained everything I could through shaky breaths, while Julie clung to me, still trying to process what had just happened. As the hours passed, the police searched the area, and paramedics checked us over. Aside from some cuts and bruises, we were physically okay, but the emotional scars were already forming. "They knew everything," I said softly to Julie later, as we sat in the wrecked living room. "They planned this. They knew we were alone." Julie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't think I'll ever be able to open the door for a stranger again." I didn't blame her. I felt the same. We had survived the night, but the sense of security we once had was gone, shattered by the knock of a stranger in need.